I don't want to say that gaming is in a slump right now, but there's been a lot of shady releases recently that have made me think critically about the industry and if this is the way things are supposed to be. I mean, look back at older generations. Things seemed perfect back then. No DLC, no microtransactions, games were actually finished before release, and they had tons of replay value. Or am I just remembering the good parts of said generations? There were probably tons of crappy games that made people feel the same way back then that I do now, and that's just minimizing the actual good games that are just coming out, because there are tons, more than ever, actually. I mentioned all this because I want to take a trip back to when games, I guess, felt better, what made them feel special, and why that led to a general feeling of optimism for the medium. There's many different reasons, but we'll be looking at what I think are some of the bigger ones. One of the biggest contributions to this enthusiasm was the popularization of online gaming. While online games did exist, it wasn't until the 6th generation of consoles that each console released a way to connect online, with the Xbox being the only one to have network functionality built in at launch. The Dreamcast, GameCube, and PlayStation 2 all had network adapters which plugged into the console and had a bunch of games to play on them, except, of course, Nintendo, who still lags behind in online today. The Dreamcast was the first console of the 6th generation and helped provide the foundation of online connectivity, not only being able to play multiplayer games but having an internet browser and one of the first uses of downloadable content in video games. The biggest and most consistent platform for online gaming at the time was Xbox Live, releasing in 2002, which allowed players not only to play games online but to keep a profile and to talk to other users while playing. There were even cringy videos by Microsoft explaining what this new online service was and how to use it.
Once you've signed up, you never have to do it again. Plus, you get to pick your gamer tag, you know, your online identity. Mine's, Dark Master. Anyway, this is the matchmaking screen. You can choose Quick Match, which will hook you up with any available gamer, or you can be more selective and use Optimatch. Optimatch lets you find the right game at your level or style.
Dude, they can hear me, and I can hear them.
That's the coolest thing about Xbox Live, the voice.
Listen, I'm going to keep on reporting you every day, yeah, till they do something about it. Watch. I know, loser. Don't message me again because you're blocked.
But when it's all said and done, you could play video games with other people from around the world, which must have been mind-blowing at the time. People were rightfully excited for this new era in gaming. It essentially opened up the floodgates to what would be gaming as we see it today. Entire genres which rely on being connected to the internet wouldn't have existed without the experimentation we saw back then. Another part of multiplayer which was the gold standard at the time was split screen. I hate saying was in that sentence, but split screen is more of an afterthought now with the focus of multiplayer being mostly online. Games still have it, but it just isn't the same. Online gaming is great and all, but being in person playing with other people is just a different experience. I know I just sung online gaming's praises 2 paragraphs ago, but people were excited at the prospect of being catered to both for in-person gaming and something totally new, playing with someone far, far away. Following in the heels of multiplayer, single player is just as, if not more important. Single player games today are largely on the back burner of the games industry since multiplayer has become the main focus. In reality, people still love a great single-player experience, but it's not viewed to be as profitable as multiplayer is. I'm not saying single-player games don't exist, but larger companies are making them less and less purely because of money. Who would you show off your skins to in a single-player game? And who would want a great story told through fun gameplay rather than a multiplayer experience that'll have you playing and paying for longer? What I'm trying to get at is that while online multiplayer was new and exciting, the choice of single-player was still there. Most large developers were still making incredible single-player experiences while also experimenting with online at the same time. Back then, if you didn't like multiplayer, there were still plenty of new and quirky single-player games to try out in each system by tons of developers, and vice versa. Another huge factor for excitement was the leap in graphics between the 5th and 6th generation of consoles. While graphics don't make or break a game, they still represent the hardware they run on and what they're capable of. The 5th console generation made the jump to 3D polygonal graphics as standard, with consoles like the Sony PlayStation, Nintendo 64, and the Sega Saturn all experimenting with 3D. This meant that a lot of the games we saw weren't very polished because of the lack of knowledge from this new form of the medium. Developers were moving to new hardware and it was difficult to create 3D games when the industry was primarily 2D just a few years prior. The developers that did stick to 2D made some amazing looking games, as developers knew how to handle 2D graphics. They were standard for over a decade at this point. A few years later, come the PlayStation 2, Dreamcast and so on, developers were more accustomed to working in 3D. This meant bigger and more ambitious games. In my opinion, this might be the biggest graphical leap in gaming history, starting around the turn of the millennium. This was during the time when you could clearly tell the difference between a game on two different consoles, unlike today. Instead of telling you about how much better your consoles are with specs, publishers just needed gameplay to prove their point, and the graphics did a great job reflecting that. You can look at a console from any given time and they have these themes and atmospheres built around them, some coming off better than others. When you look at these consoles, they look like some kind of space-age technology with these futuristic looks and sounds. Their atmospheres are filled with wonder and this curiosity on what the future could bring. Consoles before had menus, some of which being glorified CD players, but none are as memorable and as impactful as the 6th generation. The PlayStation 2 is my favorite in this regard, with the opening screen having these buildings which depend on how much storage you have filled up on your memory card. It leads you to this menu that's really calming, with these dancing dots representing the amount of seconds in the current minute using the PlayStation 2's internal clock. The ocean sounds in the background might represent something greater, so hear me out. I said that this reminds me of space-age technology, with the PS2 actually looking like a spaceship, but the ocean could tie into the PlayStation 2's internet capabilities. I think the PS2's calming waves connects to the internet, with you being on the shore side, about to dive in with whatever game you're playing. Probably not the case at all, but it's just my interpretation. The Dreamcast was the exact opposite, with this bright white boot screen with nothing more than a startup that'll make you think that the game you're about to play is more advanced and futuristic than any modern title. It's all about atmosphere. While the PS2, Xbox, and GameCube had these dark and somewhat foreboding menus, the Dreamcast was super colorful and vibrant, with a sense of optimism for Sega's future, which is funny because of the company that fell during this generation. I really like how the Dreamcast and PS2 are opposites, because it shows how radically different companies were willing to be in order to appeal to people during the same time period. They have totally different tones that represent their target audience. Do you want a bright, hope-filled future, or a dark space where someone's probably going to ask you for a lighter and a copy of San Andreas? I feel like the games coming out around this time are of note as well, because I feel like I can talk about the consoles and their menus and their startups and specs and memory card size limits all day, but they'd mean nothing if there weren't any good games out for them. That's the bulk of it anyway. The 6th gen was an era of experimentation. Nintendo put out horror games, first-person shooters, Microsoft was actually putting out exclusive titles, it was crazy. Companies were more inclined to take risks to see what crazy new ideas would work in video games. You could have some of the games that you do now, like Mario titles, Halo, Sonic, Ratchet and Clank, but at the same time, have the option to try out some really weird and out there title that, when you actually play it, ends up being actually really fun and you would genuinely enjoy it. Think Space Channel 5 on the Dreamcast, Animal Crossing on the GameCube, Psychonauts on the PS2, and, well, Halo on the Xbox. People weren't afraid to put their names on things and experiment. Really obscure titles being put on full blast led to these crazier games being successful that no one would even expect. That level of experimentation and variety is really missing from games today. Well, the more high-profile ones anyways. People love weird games, so it's a shame to see a lot of bigger companies now just follow trends and try to maximize profits instead of trying new things, but what can you do? Indies will always be there, even if that means they won't get the same attention as bigger games, but it's something. Not to mention that because online gaming was in its infancy, things like game patches weren't a thing on console yet, so companies only had one shot to release a game. No easy bug fixing or patching after launch. You can't just hype up a game, get people to buy it, and then fix it later. You have to have everything in the game you want at launch tested extensively to make sure that there were as little issues as possible. That means games launching likely had a bigger impact back then. Each new one was an entire experience, nothing would get added or removed later, and a lot of these titles came jam-packed with actual game. Also, launches in general seemed a lot cooler back then since all the games were physical. You had to actually go out and buy them. Midnight launches for games like Grand Theft Auto or Metal Gear Solid must have been insane. Games were riding high in the early 2000s. People had an incredible amount of innovation happening right before their eyes, and companies had the accessibility for developers and fun games to back themselves up. People had options, and I don't know, having 4 console manufacturers just feels right. Sony versus Microsoft and Nintendo versus Sega. There's that healthy competition since I feel Nintendo's gotten pretty complacent as of recently, and I know that Sega was already on the way out when the GameCube was released, but hey, it's just an idea. Big companies and fierce competition with all sides putting out great titles to try to sell their own systems. Imagine that. What's missing in games today is easily being rectified by the countless amount of indie developers and passionate fans that are willing to pick up the slack from these bigger companies. However, they're not the ones getting nearly the amount of praise, attention, and money they deserve. Instead, it's whoever has the biggest marketing budget. Games just felt more lively, they were more expressive. The industry feels way too corporate now, and whenever there is a new innovative idea, it's milked until any originality is gone. Even so, little risks are actually being taken by these companies in case they dare step out of line to try something original for once and see what that new innovative idea is.